His first missionary journey starts, and it lasts for 10 years. And I'll show you the whole thing. His first missionary journey, his second missionary journey, back up. Edger, don't go on your own. You got to watch out. Computers do that too. But look, his whole missionary journeys period is only 10 years, from 46 to 56. And so God saves him about 33. God takes about 13 to 14 years to prepare him and smooth him and refine him and get him equipped. And then he turns him loose to reach the world in 10 years. And what's amazing about that is that all of us are byproducts of what Paul did. Well, that takes us to the missionary that God sent era of Paul's life. Probably the part we know the best and most about. And Paul went on that first missionary journey, went on the second missionary journey, went on the third, and then he sails from Jerusalem back to Rome. And that period of time is what we find in the book of Acts. And basically that leads us into this final segment. I call it a hard, alone time in his life, when he is in jail, waiting trial. And what's amazing about it is you see what comes from that. Look at the books. Luke and Acts. Have you ever thought what Luke and Acts are? Paul had to appear before Nero in a court of law. Rome was run by legal means. And so they had all kinds of lawyers, just like we still have. Everything is run by lawyers. It was back then, too. And so Paul appealed to Caesar. Caesar said, what's on the docket? Okay, lawyers, read the case. Inform me what I'm supposed to look for when this case comes. And so Paul had to present his case. Most likely, what the Lord did. Think about this. Everybody of any power in the Roman Empire would have surrounded Nero. And all those people were sitting in the Supreme Court with Nero sitting there, and someone comes up and summarizes the case. And they had the book of Luke and the book of Acts. Most likely, those two books were the attending documents that came with Paul before Nero. And so Nero probably wasn't listening, because you know him, but at least court officials heard the entire gospel message. That's why Paul, just before he's executed, said, many people in Caesar's household are now believers. You see, God's plan was to stop Paul's life on the road and to get him kind of off in the ditch, in jail, waiting to be executed. So Luke and Acts could be written, and so he could explain everything to, the Ephesians and Philippians and Colossians and Philemon, and then write those pastoral epistles in his final imprisonment and kind of straighten out everything that's needed for the church. But what is the lesson from that? Run the race. God can do so much in a short period of time. If God had not prepared Paul alone in the desert, back home with his hometown crowd, and then that final prep with Barnabas, God could not have used Paul as greatly as he did for 10 years. Think in God's terms instead of human terms. We run everything so humanly. God shows us his training plan, just like the 3+ years with the apostles. Jesus said you need all this time face to face before you launch out on your own. One last thing from Paul's life. Those epistles that he wrote, those epistles flowed from the hardest time in his life. Paul was alone. He said, everyone's abandoned me. I have nobody that's coming to me. Timothy, bring me my coat and my study materials. God wants to use us as his servant. And basically, what I wrote down about that is we need to learn contentment. Did you know what Paul had to learn? He had to learn that Christ is enough. Not Christ and notoriety of winning the world. By the time Paul gets to jail, most people, enough years went by, most people forgot him. Can you imagine that? They didn't have the internet back then. And it was word of mouth. They had those letters, and it got to be that people in the churches were reading letters from Paul, and they didn't even know who Paul was. They just knew they were from God. You see, God doesn't want superheroes people that the church depends on. He wants us to depend on Christ. And He wants all of us to only be a conduit to point people to Christ. Do you remember where we started in chapter 14 of Acts? They said all that God had done with them. Do you know what that made the early church think? God can do that with me. They didn't say, look at everything I did. Then everyone says, I could never do what you did. You can't. But look at all that God did with me, made the people of the early church step up and say, God, what would you like to do with me? I'm an edger. Fill me. Energize me. Hold me and use me. And whenever you want, you can park me back in the garage. Do you have anything else for me to do? What did Paul do at the end? He wrote letters and led the people. He had a nonstop group of soldiers. He was a capital prisoner of the emperor, and if you lost him, you would be killed. And Paul was always chained to soldiers so that they could never lose him and lose their life. And so Paul would say, hi, Bill. It's your shift again, isn't it? Have I told you my testimony? He'd go, 5 times, sir. Paul said, could I tell it to you again? The guy says, do I have a choice? Paul said, no. And he told him the gospel. And did you know what Paul eventually did? He won his captors, some of them, to Christ. Learn contentment. God can use us anywhere.